So for this I'm comparing the Mavic Air to the Mavic Pro, and obviously there's newer models out on the market. They already have a Mavic Air 2 and a Mavic Pro 2, and both of those drones are going to be better than what I'm using right here. But the drone technology is so good that I think you can still get away with using these first generation models. Both the Mavic Air and the Mavic Pro shoot in 4K, and they're both incredibly stable even in windy conditions. They're both pretty reliable, and they can fly very far away. You don't really need much more than that unless you're shooting really high level professional quality stuff. But with that being said, I think the video quality that you get out of the Mavic Air is still professional level. So if you're looking to save money and you don't think you really need the latest and greatest technology, the technology that they packed into this little Mavic Air is pretty impressive. So this is a little bit outdated, but the Air 2 is a little bit bigger and heavier. So this, right now, I think this is the best combination of very small size, very packable, lightweight, and still pretty good video quality. The Mavic Air 2 definitely steps it up as far as video quality, and I'm sure it's a better drone overall. But if a small size and lightweight is your main priority, then I think this is the best drone to go with. DJI does make some smaller drones than this. They have the Spark and the Mini. But in my opinion, those are not quite usable as far as video quality. And the drones themselves are not quite good enough to be a reliable drone to take on a backpacking trip. This case that it comes in is really handy. Very minimalist design, but it's kind of a hard shell and it offers really good protection for the drone. One thing that I wish it came with is some sort of case for the controller and some extra batteries. I just use an extra pouch that I had, and I keep the controller in here and the extra batteries. So when I'm flying this in the winter, obviously I don't want to put the drone down in the snow, so I usually just put the case in the snow and then turn the drone on and let it do its calibration on top of the case. One thing I really like about this controller is that the joysticks can unscrew, and they have a little place in here to store them. It makes the controller a lot easier to store and to carry, because with these joysticks on here, it's some kind of awkward thing sticking out and it doesn't pack very well. And I have actually broken joysticks before because they're kind of a weak point that's sticking off of the controller. One thing you do have to be careful of with this drone, and I think most drones, is that you have to keep the batteries warm. In the summer it's not really an issue, but flying out here in the winter, try to make sure that my batteries are kind of tucked away in an insulated place in my backpack so they don't get too cold. Because if the batteries are too cold, the drone won't even take off, or it'll take off and then land in like 5 seconds. As long as the drone thinks that the battery's warm enough at takeoff, I can usually get a full flight out of it, and the cold doesn't really seem to affect the flight time too much. One thing that can be kind of frustrating with the Mavic Air is that it sometimes takes a few tries to calibrate the compass. With my Mavic Pro, it only takes 1, maybe 2 tries to calibrate the compass, and this one can be a little bit more finicky. I've also noticed that the sensors on this thing aren't quite as reliable or accurate as the Mavic Pro. There's been a few times when I've been flying this thing and I'm not touching the sticks at all, and it'll just start to drift away from me. And I think that's because the compass or some sensor is not calibrated correctly. The drone thinks that it's staying in place, but the sensors are telling it to compensate for something, so that's why it drifts away. And that can be pretty frustrating sometimes. And one thing that is nice about the Mavic Air is that it has 8 gigabytes of built-in storage. Now, I don't really use that often, but there has been a few times when I forget my SD card, and it really sucks to come all the way out here only to realize that you have no SD card. So that 8 gigabytes of internal storage has definitely saved me a few times. So I've been using this drone for about a year, and I've had a pretty good chance to really test it out and put it through its paces. That includes all winter last winter and then all summer this year. So it's seen a very wide variety of weather conditions. I think that's kind of the point of having a drone like this, something that's really small and portable, is that you can carry it very far and you can carry it into a very wide variety of conditions. For being such a tiny little drone, it's kind of amazing how stable it is and how much it's not really affected by the wind. This thing has quite a bit of power for how little it is, and its top speed can still go up to almost 40 miles an hour. I think the main difference between a drone like this and a step up, which would be the Mavic Pro, is that the signal connection between the drone and the controller is not nearly as good on this one as it is compared to the Mavic Pro. The Mavic Pro uses DJI's own proprietary radio frequency, and it's really strong and really powerful. I could fly like 2 miles away and have no problem. And with the Mavic Air, it uses a Wi-Fi signal, which is a much weaker signal and much more prone to interference and stuff like that. Out here in the mountains, it's not much of a problem, but if I'm flying closer to civilization, where there's a lot of other radio frequencies, a lot of other Wi-Fi signals, and a lot of interference like that, the signal can cut out within like 1,000 feet. So it really depends where you are and what kind of interference is in the area. But out in the wilderness, the Wi-Fi signal is definitely still usable. And with a good clear line of sight between me and the drone, then I can fly pretty far away. At least a mile, sometimes 2 miles away. I think I'll do a test right now and see how far away I can fly. One thing that's different about the Air compared to the Pro is with the controller. On the Mavic Pro controller, there's a wheel up by your right finger that allows you to control exposure, and each click of the wheel changes one stop of exposure. I'm not sure why they got rid of that. That's kind of annoying, because on the Mavic Air there's just a button, and then you can click on the screen and change exposure that way. It's just a couple more steps to change exposure, but because of that, it's actually made me pretty much only use auto exposure on the Mavic Air. With the Mavic Pro, I usually use manual exposure just because it gives me a little bit more control, but without having that ability to change exposure easily, I keep it on auto exposure with the Mavic Air. But the auto exposure on the Mavic Air is much better than it is on the Pro, and it's pretty usable. I hardly ever have to go into manual exposure with the Air. So I'm at 4,000 feet away and still looking pretty strong. My top speed right now in the regular mode is about 19 miles an hour. If I put it into sport mode, I'd be going 35, almost 40.
Battery level is low. The aircraft will go to the home point in 10 seconds.
Alright, 7,200 feet away, and then it's telling me to go home. I'm at about 50% battery. It's pretty good considering I started that flight at only 75% battery. So it only took about 25% of the battery to go over 7,000 feet. That's not bad. Now I'm flying back into sport mode, going about 35 miles an hour. Another thing to get used to with the Mavic Air compared to the Pro is that the Mavic Air, when it's moving at a fast speed, it's at a much higher angle of degree. So that means that the camera has to compensate for that, and the camera can only tilt up so high. So if the drone is going really fast forward, that means that the camera has to tilt down a little bit farther. And sometimes if you start a little bit slower and then you speed up, the camera's going to tilt down automatically, and that ruins some shots sometimes, so you have to be kind of aware of that. But the video quality and the stability of the drone is just as good as the Mavic Pro. The 4K video coming out of this is actually slightly better. This shoots 4K video at 100 megabits a second, and the Mavic Pro only shoots 4K at 60 megabits a second. So there's a little bit more data in this video. That just gives you a little bit more range when you're color grading. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you want to see more of these gear reviews and real actual adventures with this gear in action. The big adventures are what I'm really interested in, and that's how I get the experience to do these gear reviews. So I don't just get brand new gear and talk about it. Everything that I'm reviewing here has been used for a long time, and I find that this stuff takes a lot of experience to figure out. I have failed in every way possible to figure out the most efficient and easiest way to do a lot of this stuff. So I know the weak points of all this stuff and how it actually works in the real world.